Next hurricane season is going to be off the chain.
Gonna go back to La Nina, right?
La Nina, crazy warm water temperatures. There are like 5 different reasons why next year could be.
Okay, Matt, this year has been a very active year. So it was kind of hard to pinpoint which 10 weather events we kind of wanted to highlight this year. And you were one of the ones that has been traveling. This year for you has been a very active travel year. And I know you've covered a lot of these events. So I'm excited to talk to you about what you saw in the field and what we covered this year. It's just a lot of content.
It's been a very busy year. We're so glad so many folks stuck around for a forecast. But, you know, I never thought I'd be tracking a tropical storm on the West Coast or flying into the eye of a hurricane or all these crazy things. It's been a very busy year content-wise, but also we've had a lot of wild weather. I think one thing that stands out right off the bat, January, we had 9 back-to-back-to-back atmospheric rivers, dumped 32 trillion gallons worth of rainfall and snow on California. Our photog Matt Hyland and I went out. We actually got up in the Sierra Nevada when something like 3 or 4 feet of snow fell. Then we went down to Sacramento, chased a tornadic thunderstorm in the middle of the night. There were mudslides, landslides all over the place. 21 people died in California just in January. It was pretty high end, and I think the Sierra Nevada saw like 3 times their average annual snowpack.
California had a pretty active year in general. It was kind of a precursor to kind of the events that they were going to see later on in the year. I know, you traveled to California, and kind of talk a little bit about that experience. I know for our photographer, Matt Hyland, it was one of the first times he saw snow.
You know what's interesting to me? Atmospheric rivers for folks at home are these filaments of moisture that are kind of aimed towards the coast. In the higher terrain, they get the snow. In the lower terrain, they get rain. But what struck me was that even after an atmospheric river comes in, you get convection or shower thunderstorm activity beneath the core of the driving low pressure that's responsible for swinging that atmospheric river east. So you get like 2 or 3 different rounds with each one. But when you factor like 9 different low pressure systems all back to back to back, it's no wonder they got such a deluge, but with severe weather too. It just was such a significant series of events. They needed the rainfall. They really did. It basically erased the California drought, but at the same time, we got major flood impacts too. Then we segued right into severe weather season. The spring, obviously very active with one of the strongest tornadoes we've had in years.
Yeah, and that was the Rolling Fork tornado on a moderate risk day.
Yep.
Which was a level 4 out of 5.
Yep.
We talk about that a lot, but this day was significant. And I think we were covering it live.
Definitely be on alert over the next hour or so. These storms are coming very close to your area.
And this thing was on the ground for 71 minutes, EF4 damage. That meant 195 mile-per-hour winds. The Weather Service actually tracked down that EF4 damage to a flower shop on Walnut Street downtown. The entire thing was just a bare slab of cement afterwards. And what was interesting was after the 17 people died in Rolling Fork, the tornado continued on, and it snapped a bunch of utility poles out of the ground. Some were never found, but they actually found some covered in about 2 inches worth of mud. So it goes to show you just how strong that tornado was. But, a high-end event, and unfortunately it triggered a tornado emergency, but resulted in some pretty serious loss of life.
Those communities still recovering from that, and, segueing into the next severe weather risk. This year, severe weather was active up until the summer. This particular one was a high-risk day, and those are very rare.
On March 31st?
Yes, and there were actually 2 areas of high risk. And so talking about severe weather, it was an active season, and that continued until the summer. And one particular day that, is noteworthy is the high-risk day, which there's actually 2 areas, one in the Midwest and one in the Southeast.
So March 31st, 2 severe weather risk areas, as you mentioned, both high risks, 5 out of 5, top tier risk for long track violent tornadoes, and unfortunately 147 touched down, the 3rd worst tornado outbreak from pure numbers on record. We had a number of fatalities. We had significant EF4 tornadoes, including one that hit near Kyoto, Iowa. And one that really stuck out to me was the one that hit Wynne, Arkansas. That one moved through, but afterwards, the updraft, the upward motion from that tornado was so strong it caused ripples at the mid-levels of the atmosphere called gravity waves, which we could even see on radar. I've only seen that probably once or twice, which was obscene. Another storm up in Iowa produced a debris fall. So much debris was lofted by the tornado that debris actually fell on Interstate 80, and you could see that really well on radar in the app with the little blue spattering essentially showing where spiky shapes, that debris was sighted in the atmosphere by radar. It was one of those events that folks will be talking about for years to come.
It happened kind of in the first 3 months of the year. So already starting off severe weather season, pretty active.
I think one of the key takeaways with this outbreak was how far we've come with issuing tornado warnings, with getting the science down and being able to communicate proactively to the public. Metro Little Rock, for example, got a really bad tornado, an EF3 with 160 plus mile per hour winds. The Weather Service issued a tornado emergency, and yet despite the fact that a massive city was hit by a massive tornado, no loss of life.
With severe weather events, we always talk about tornadoes, hail, and damaging winds, but something else that also occurs frequently, even during the spring, is flooding.
Here's some flooding in Mary Brickell Village.
And that is what happened in South Florida this year.
Yeah, and flooding's oftentimes deadlier than severe weather, than pretty much any other weather hazard. Between the 12th and 13th of April, they got 25.91 inches worth of rain in Fort Lauderdale. Their average annual rainfall is like 3 times that. So realistically, they got a third of their rainfall for the entire year in 24 hours. And essentially what had happened was you had a low in the Gulf of Mexico pulling in air, but there was a little boundary nearby kind of lurking right over South Florida. All that moisture was forced along the boundary. It was squeezed out of the air. You got relentless rounds of rain with 3, 4, 5 inches of rain per hour. You got multiple tornadic circulation swirling in more moisture. Ultimately, they got flash flood emergency conditions. They got
flights canceled.
I remember
the
airport was underwater.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seemed like this was like the year of the metro flooding.
Okay.
For example, New York City on October 6th got a ton of rainfall between 6 and 10 inches from a weird setup called an inverted trough. Basically, we have, as you know very well, like an offshore low, but a little filament of extra low pressure protruding back towards the coast, funneling moisture towards the coast like a conveyor belt, and it's really tough to forecast. I think the fact that we could see it coming up to 2 days out for something so narrow really attests to how far the science has come, but also there's a huge impact there in the city.
Some of the footage I remember seeing where cars were underwater, cars were stranded.
Oh yeah.
New York City is the #1 populous city in America. So seeing that type of flooding event happening there was pretty crazy. And there was, people everywhere. So a lot of things happened this year in terms of flooding. Of course, flooding is such a dangerous weather event and something to take seriously. Now we head into the summer, and this is where things start to get interesting in terms of weather for the year. This one in particular was astounding. New York City was #1 for the worst air quality in the world. Orange sky in New York City, it looked apocalyptic. It was crazy for those residents who lived up there.
I lived in DC and we had code purple air qualities. The airport shut down for a time because the planes couldn't take off and land because they couldn't see a darn thing. Visibility is below a mile. It was weird because I lived there at the time, and I was forecasting this on TV. I was forecasting this for MyRadar, as were you. And it's one thing to forecast something, but to look out your window to see it, to smell the smoke, to taste the smoke is another thing. Of course, we had those fires raging for a long time in Quebec, Ontario, low pressure over the Gulf of Maine swirling down that smoke, and it seemed like any time we got a northerly or northwesterly wind, we got more smoke. But I think there is an interesting climate element to this too, because if we look back at May, we see this massive record-setting heat dome sprawled across Canada. Basically, high pressure, hot, dry, sinking air that desiccated the landscape, sapped all the moisture out of the ground, which makes fuels ripe to burn. But then on June 1st, we had something to ignite everything. We had that big band of thunderstorms. And you remember this, the satellite the next day, look at all the hot spots. It's pretty telling.
Some people I think that this came out of nowhere. But we could look at what happened in Canada, and like you just explained, and that explains the story pretty much. And the air quality sweeping all the way down to DC, it wasn't just New York. That's a lot of residents, I think, will not forget that day.
And I think it underscores there's this idea in meteorology where if it hasn't happened before, we have to be reluctant to forecast it. And I think we're sort of entering new territory with many cases where, I find myself forecasting things that I never thought I'd be forecasting. I think when it comes to the public, they oftentimes have to prepare for events that they don't have a reference point for. And that's why it's even more important for them to stay tuned these days, to pay attention to forecasts, to have a resource like the MyRadar app, because ultimately, if they don't know what's coming, they're going to be definitely caught off guard by something they haven't seen before.
August 20th, 2023 was pretty interesting. This was a tropical system that we were tracking for California before anybody on the East Coast even dealt with a tropical system. And this is one of the ones that you traveled to and you saw this firsthand.
I flew out there. Palm Springs, California averages 5 inches of rain per year. They got like 2+ inches from just Hilary, which is 40+% of their average annual precipitation. Death Valley, California saw their wettest day on record. This was a moisture-loaded system literally tracking into the desert. What's weird is, I've always wanted to go to Death Valley or see the Joshua trees or all these cool things. I never in a million years thought I would see those things amid tropical storm conditions, 40+ mile-per-hour gusts, the rain squalls. It even smelled like all the other tropical storms I've chased in the Atlantic. It was the weirdest thing.
This is the first time that National Weather Service meteorologists issued tropical alerts in Southern California.
Oh yeah.
And this was for the Eastern Pacific. This had nothing to do with the Atlantic tropical season. So it just goes to show that, the Eastern Pacific hurricane season is definitely an important one to keep an eye on, because things like this can happen. And for example, what we saw this year, California.
Folks who haven't been to California will say 2 inches, that's nothing. But when you're talking about literally like a sand pit out there near the Salton Sea, for example, we had rain for about 10-15 minutes and suddenly the roads were washed out. You couldn't get by. I saw places that had previously just been empty fields that suddenly were new lakes. That area can't really handle rainfall much. Understandably, 2-3 inches can have a huge impact there, and that's really what happened.
With just how active it's also been in California, usually we talk about drought in California, and that's not one of the stories that we're even tracking this year.
Feast or
because
famine.
They've had such an active year in terms of Hilary coming in and more atmospheric rivers. So California, definitely one of those top states that we have been tracking this past several years.
If you like this video and want to see more like it, click on the like button. It really helps us out a lot. And of course, if you are not subscribed to the channel, subscribe. It's totally free. And click on that notification bell. That way you always know whenever we drop a new video or whenever we go live.
Now, from tracking tropical systems in the Eastern Pacific, on August 30th, we got Idalia.
Whoa.
Obviously, we were tracking it days before.
Yeah.
But that's when you went out to Florida, and you were actually in the field chasing this as well.
It's funny, it came ashore in the Big Bend of Florida, which really doesn't see major hurricane landfalls in general. And yet, when it came ashore, it weakened very quickly. It didn't feel like a major hurricane. But I think it sort of underscores the fact that the winds, the max winds in a hurricane, as we talked about at the Flash Conference, aren't like a big buzzsaw of wind. They're these little micro-scale, small-scale features in the eye. Back in 1992, when Hurricane Andrew passed through South Florida, Wakimoto and Fujita essentially hypothesized that there were these smaller, what they called mini swirls, little whirlwinds, if you will, a few feet wide, that whip through the eye.
Oh, roof going! Roof gone right now! Iowa, Hurricane Idalia making landfall.
I'd heard about these before, but when I was chasing, there were so many times where we'd be driving down the road in the eye wall, and suddenly this little vortex would swing across the road, and the winds would gust over 100 miles per hour, and it'd down a tree or two, and then it'd be, background winds 60, 70, and then another one of these little whirlwinds. I believe that there were tornadoes in the eye wall of Idalia. I think that just the pure mesovortices, the micro-scale vortices, all these weird, tiny little eddies of wind are something that I think we'll be studying for a while. Storm Chaser's got great video.
So we're in the middle of the storm right now. Unfortunately, the backside is where we have just about as much of an issue, if not more.
I actually got to go in the eye too. It was only about 4 or 5 miles wide. And
that was infamous because we did that on our live stream. We loved the energy. You were explaining it very well to the audience. The audience gave good feedback.
I've been in the eye of hurricanes before, and it always strikes me how quickly the transition occurs. You're in the eye while you're in that buzzsaw of winds, the donut of furious winds, and suddenly there's like a big gust and you're expecting another one because it's been gusting for 30, 40 minutes, and then there's just nothing after it. And suddenly it's quiet and it's calm and the mist starts to lift, and then you can see what we call the stadium effect. Essentially, 40,000 feet up on all sides, you have these thunderstorms all around you, and yet you're in this moat, this oasis of calm. The other thing I noticed too, thousands of birds in the eye because they've been sucked into the eye by the low pressure, by the inward funneling winds, and they can't escape, so they're forced to get stuck in the eye and just kind of ride it out until the circulation dissipates and weakens. I'd heard about that before, but to see all these birds swirling around, not sure what to do, was very impressive.
And Idalia was interesting because it was the only tropical system to make landfall in the U.S.
Yeah, and
Hilary didn't count because that made landfall in Mexico, but
yeah,
you know, very interesting. It was still an active hurricane season, but Idalia was the only one. It was a Category 3 when it made landfall, intensified to a Category 4 before it weakened, like you said earlier. And so that was the one that we were tracking here on MyRadar, and it was the only one that made landfall this year.
We only had 2 hurricane landfalls. Not only, I mean, you mentioned one in the United States, but I think Barbuda got hit too. But for the entire season, with how many named storms we had, the 4th most active season on record, to only get 2 hurricane landfalls, I consider that kind of a win for the season. We dodged a big bullet.
One of the important reasons we pay attention to the Eastern Pacific is some of the reasons why Hawaii was struck with one of the deadliest wildfires they've had. This actually played a role. Hurricane Dora, formed in the Eastern Pacific, moved with high pressure to the north and it passing to the south. That's pretty much what triggered some of the craziest wildfires.
The wildfires, of course, were caused when a power pole got knocked over by those strong winds, but you also had downsloping, so air going down the mountains, heating up, compressing, drying out, and then accelerating downhill, exacerbating and amplifying those winds even more, allowing that fire to spread quickly. It's unfortunate how closely packed together the homes and the structures were. I think that from a civil planning standpoint, we have to have conversations, difficult conversations, about how we plan our communities such that when and if a wildfire happens, folks can evacuate. There were a lot of things that went wrong with this fire in Lahaina. The winds definitely played a role, and it's interesting to see that even a storm so far distant and removed as Dora was can still have an impact far away.
And communities in Hawaii are still recovering, and unfortunately, they're going to still be recovering for several more years. I think for Matthew Cappucci, one of the most memorable events that he attended this year was the Annular Eclipse on October 14th.
When the moon blocks the sun, different things can happen. If the moon is close enough, big enough in our skies to cover the sun, you get a total solar eclipse. Next one's April 8th, 2024. For years, I wanted my wedding to be on April 8th. It's not gonna happen, but I'm still going out there. I think everyone here is going, so highly recommend. But anyway, on October 14th, we had an annular, so a ring of fire solar eclipse. Essentially, the moon was a little too far away to be big enough in our skies to block the sun. So a little sliver of sunlight was visible on all sides, but it caused what we call that ring of fire eclipse. And it was weird because the landscape didn't go dark, but the temperature definitely dropped. The shadows got sharper. The landscape was like in a sepia. It dimmed a little bit. And then, of course, we used special cameras to get this amazing picture of the ring of fire. On the bottom left right now, you can see what we call Bailey's beads, essentially the last rays of sunlight, kind of like pinpricks poking through the valleys and the depressions on the surface of the moon. It was amazing. And it happened to be over Albuquerque, which at the time was having what they call balloon fiesta. Hundreds of hot air balloons taken to the skies every morning. It was so darn cool to see. Unfortunately, our flight got canceled due to breezy winds that made it tough to take off and land, but Yeah, it was awesome, and it was a great appetizer for the main show, which comes next year, Monday, April 8th. I know you're coming.
Yeah, so if you didn't get to see the annular eclipse this year, April 8th is your day. We're coming on our last event for the year, and you know there's so many that happened, but we wanted to highlight some of the important ones, and this was one that just happened 4 days ago. We're shooting this on a Tuesday here, but this is one you just recently covered. It was on a weekend, on a Saturday, December 9th, a severe weather event in December.
23 tornadoes, and yeah, we do have a second season in the fall and the winter months, but to get 23 tornadoes, to have multiple tornado emergencies issued, EF3s plus in areas just north of Nashville, Tennessee. You know, Hendersonville saw 6 fatalities with that tornado, and it actually struck a power station too, causing amazing video, but also it underscores just how bad the damage was. You know what's interesting too, going into this event, it was a very conditional, so a very iffy setup. We knew that the winds were changing speed with height, but they didn't really change direction, which made me and a lot of other forecasters think everything would form into a line. And as you know, like squall lines don't really produce those intense tornadoes. You had quick spin-ups. And yet, for whatever reason, you got a litany of discrete, lone, isolated supercells that could, instead of merging into a line, take full advantage of the wind dynamics of the atmosphere, produce these high-end tornadoes somewhere on the ground for 20, 30, 40 plus miles. And the event really quickly became one of the most significant tornado episodes of the year, almost 2 years to the day
of the Mayfield.
Since the Mayfield, Kentucky disaster that killed upwards of 60, almost 70 people.
And that was just to the north of that area. It goes to show, always pay attention to severe weather. December 9th, December 10th, you know, anniversary of the Mayfield, Kentucky tornado. December tornadoes can happen, and you know, tornadoes happen in any month of the year.
I always say the atmosphere doesn't own a calendar. I think when it comes to severe weather too, people always think of Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas. They get all their tornadoes in 6 weeks. But for the deep south, the Tennessee Valley, they get them over the course of like 7, 8, 9 months of the year. So they have to live in a heightened state of awareness, essentially from November all the way through June. And for that reason, it can be really easy for people to let their guard down this time of year. And they just can't and shouldn't do that.
I know those communities are very resilient. They're some of the strongest communities. I know you've been in those areas, and those people there are very resilient. But when it comes to severe weather, you know, it's always great to pay attention. I think now there's so much, you know, communities are becoming more aware. Severe weather's happening more frequently, especially winter all the way to December. Just goes to show, again, be prepared all year long. And of course, we're gonna be here for you guys covering it and keeping track of it.
24/7, nonstop, we're here.
We have to talk about an honorable mention, and I think, you know, this made headlines for weeks, was Hurricane Otis. Didn't make landfall in the US, but it devastated Acapulco. The forecast leading up to it, both of you and I were forecasting it, and it blew our mind.
It was abysmal. I mean, not only, it wasn't just that you and I botched this. Every meteorologist out there botched this. Every model botched this. Not a single weather model 24 hours out had this thing coming ashore is stronger than 60 miles per hour. It made landfall at 160. We were off by 100 miles per hour. People went to bed expecting a run-of-the-mill tropical storm, and the next day, their entire town was destroyed. I would venture to say, of every Category 5 out there, I think the number of people who found themselves in a Category 5 eye wall was probably greatest with this storm than really any other storm I can think of, other than maybe Homestead, Florida with Andrew in 1992. To have a major metro under a Cat 5 eye wall, and the onshore side is just unheard of.
And for Hurricane Otis to do that less than 24 hours, it was a tropical storm in the morning, I remember tracking it, and then by the time it made landfall, already a Category 5.
It was like 12 hours of that jump, it was insane.
Yeah. And the models didn't pick it up. It's something that I know the communities in Acapulco will remember for a very long time. As a meteorologist, I think it's one that you're not going to hear us stop talking about. It's a record-breaking hurricane in the Eastern Pacific.
And also the fact that if we're off this much, if none of us saw it, there's something fundamentally with the science that we're missing. This isn't just oh, I thought A would happen, B happened instead. There's something fundamentally that we're missing. And I think it's really tough for the meteorological community to say that, but we gotta go back to the drawing board. Either there's a piece of the science we're missing, either our modeling's not complete, or perhaps there's some non-linearity in the system where when water temperatures reach a certain threshold, I mean, I don't know, I'm spitballing here, but there's something that we don't know.
As you can tell, we're just astounded by this storm. So we just wanted to mention that because it's just one of those that really shocked the meteorology community this year. An honorable mention, obviously, is Hurricane Lee, which was the strongest of the season, didn't affect land, but intensified to a Category 5 hurricane as well.
Photojournalist Jack Branca and I flew into the storm, and thankfully he brought some Dramamine. Definitely used the barf bag several times. It was pretty cool to be inside a major hurricane.
You know, you've had some amazing experiences this year, you know.
I've seen everything twice. I've done everything twice. I'm 150 years old and I'm ready for soup in a nursing home.
I'm tired.
And unfortunately, next hurricane season in the Atlantic looking pretty busy. We have a La Nina, meaning upper level winds will be weaker, easier for storms to form. We'll have more upward motion, ascent over the Atlantic, making it easier for storms to form. We're kind of going into it with record warm water temperatures already right now. Assuming that continues, I see no reason to expect a lesser hurricane season next year.
So talking about now, I know a lot of questions. What is this next upcoming hurricane season going to do? We don't know exactly yet, but just by the climate patterns, we're in an El Nino. Some forecasts are picking up that we may go back into La Nina. As we know, previous years from 2020, 2021, those were La Nina years, which were very active. But so was this past year. So that's something that's going to be interesting.
I worry too, especially like given how active this year was with an El Nino. La Nina makes it even worse. Weaker winds in the upper atmosphere, making it easier for storms to form. More ascent, upward motion, so again, making it easier for storms to form. We're going in with record warm water temperatures, and so I see no reason to expect next season to be anything less than very active to perhaps hyperactive.
Communities along the Gulf Coast always are vigilant, but over the next several months, as we fine-tune the hurricane forecast, more of the NOAA hurricane forecasts come out, we'll know a little bit more about the hurricane season, but for now, that's what we're seeing. Still a little too early, but of course, we're going to keep up to date with it.
And of course, it only ever takes one. With that, it's been a very busy year. I'm kind of glad 2023 is drawing to a close. Looking forward to the eclipse next year and, of course, whatever Mother Nature throws our way. You folks at home, download the MyRadar app. It is great. Highly recommend. You can see our forecast in there in both English and Spanish. Everything that goes on, we've got you covered. That's a promise. We're with you every step of the way. Thanks for watching.
Follow MyRadar on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Download MyRadar on iOS, Android, Amazon Alexa, Xbox, and Windows.